morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. A lot of big stuff actually happening here domestically. So first of all, we have the very latest on that utter betrayal of big union guy Joe Biden, who is now a union buster, strike breaker, all of the rest. So some legislative action there. We will break that down for you. We also have new indications from the Fed on exactly what they are doing. Markets are happy, but those who earn wages may not be. We also have more moves with regards to Twitter. European regulators indicating they may crack down, may block the app if they don't change what they are doing and how they are approaching things under Elon Musk. We also have gay marriage now codified, passed through the Senate. We've got the details of which Republicans voted for it and which ones did not. So that's also very interesting. And we have some new inside details about the now infamous meeting with Trump and Kanye West and Milo Yiannopoulos and Nick Fuentes, and questions over whether this may have been all a setup, which is pretty interesting to get to. And then we had to add this into the show. This was crazy. Sam Bankman-Fried sat for an hour-long interview with the New York Times' Andrew Ross Sorkin. He got asked about everything. How much money do you have left? Hey, what happened? Were you lying? How much money did you steal? All of the rest. So we have that for you as well that we added into the show last minute. We also have Ross Barkan back to talk about moves that Mayor Eric Adams is making to have police involuntarily commit more mentally ill homeless people. Obviously, that is extraordinarily controversial. So all of that is in the show. But before we get to that, live show.
Live show. Put it up there on the screen. New York and Boston.
Next week, guys. This is coming down to the wire.
December 7th. Go ahead and buy tickets, guys. It's going to be a hell of a lot of fun. We've got a fun show planned for all of you. We've got the meet and greet with the VIPs for our lifetime members, who we will be reimbursing the tickets, just as a reminder to all of them. And I just want to say thank you again to everybody who's bought tickets so far. If you can, we would really like to have a sold-out show, and it'll be a hell of a lot of fun. So links down there in the description. With that, let's get to the real stuff.
And by the way, guys, these are the last dates we have on the calendar for a while.
That's right.
So, we've been excited. It's been fun doing these live shows. Super excited to come back to New York and to come to Boston for the first time. So if you're able to join us, we would absolutely love that. All right. Let's get to the rail strike that the Biden administration is attempting to avert. We've had legislative action now in the House, and there were a couple of things that happened here. So I've gone through the backstory here 15 different times, but essentially, railway labor relations are governed by a separate set of law that enables Congress to intervene and cram down whatever deal they want on labor and on the rail industry. So you had a tentative deal that was put forward by the Biden administration working with the railroad bosses and also with the union leaders. And you had a significant percentage of workers, rank and file workers, who looked at that deal, saw that they were only getting one paid day of sick leave, which is insane, and said, no, this is not good enough. Well, the Biden administration, Joe Biden himself, came in and said, okay, well, we don't care. I'm going to ask Congress to go ahead and force this deal on you, even though many of you voted this down. Nancy Pelosi jumping right in and going along with it. But you had two things that were interesting that happened that made things a little bit more complicated. You had progressives led by Jamal Bowman saying this is unacceptable. We must also pass paid sick leave. Bernie Sanders leading that side on the Senate. And you also, and I think this mattered in terms of how this is all going down, you also had a few Republicans led by Marco Rubio also saying this is unfair to workers. So sort of putting some pressure on Democrats to cut a better deal for workers than what was in that original tentative agreement. So instead of doing what would have made all the sense in the world, which is to just add some paid sick days into the tentative agreement, they decided to do this complicated thing of having one vote on the tentative agreement as it stands and a separate vote on adding 7 paid sick days into the deal. So that has now passed the House. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. The headline here is House votes to avert rail strike, impose deal on unions. You have statements here from the railroad, like the corporate association. They say, unless Congress wants to become the de facto endgame for future negotiations, any effort to put its thumb on the bargaining scale to artificially advantage either party or otherwise obstruct a swift resolution would be wholly irresponsible. So they're pissed off about the paid sick leave vote that occurred as well, and also also passed, although by a more narrow margin. On the other hand, you have the Labor Coalition. They are also upset. They say that they praised the vote to add sick time. They told lawmakers who voted against it that they had, quote, abandoned your working class constituents. Just as a reminder here, as things stand right now, most rail workers do not get any paid sick time. And this whole thing, just to put it in context and step back for a second, this whole thing is because the railroad bosses do not want to cut even a percentage point into their extraordinary profit margins to make sure that their workers, when they get sick, can take a little bit of time off. That's it. That's what the whole thing is about. And at this point, Biden is basically having his, Patco moment. Air traffic controllers famously back, Reagan busted that strike. He is having a very similar moment here and attempting to bust this potential railroad worker strike, taking away all of their leverage after they've been through all of the paces and siding at the end of the day. He wrings his hands and he's reluctant, but at the end of the day, he has sided with the railroad bosses here. In terms of who voted what way, let's go ahead and put this More Perfect Union tweet up on the screen. They say breaking House passes legislation guaranteeing 7 days of paid sick leave as part of a mandated rail labor agreement. The vote was 221 to 207. All of the Democrats backed the measure. Okay, that's good. All Republicans opposed it except for 3. The Senate is expected to vote on the rail labor contract tomorrow. We are actually not sure exactly when the Senate is expected to take up these 2 pieces. But Saagar, it seems pretty clear here that, the bottom line is the Biden administration really didn't care about the paid sick leave. All they really care about is cramming down this core tentative agreement. And so by keeping these 2 votes divided, makes it very possible, if not likely, that in the Senate, you get the tentative agreement passed and the paid sick leave, which is the part that's really important to workers, goes down in flames.
Yeah, ironically, and we'll get to this, it may be the Republicans who sink the deal. And I'll talk more about their political motivations later on. But I actually think it's very, again, important to understand something I laid out before. The 7 railway companies had a combined net income of $27 billion. That is up from $15 billion a decade earlier. Over the past decade, 6 of the 7 publicly traded railway stocks have paid out $146 billion in stock buybacks and dividends, $30 billion more in cash than they invested in their own businesses. On top of that, their stock is up by 300% in the last decade. On top of that, they've actually shrunk their workforce, which is part of the reason why these guys are being worked so hard on the railroads. And they did not negotiate their deal in good faith with the government because, and I think it's becoming very clear, Krystal, the rail companies basically told Biden, they're like, this is as far as we're going to go. And Biden was like, okay, well, if the unions don't go for it, I'll just force Congress to ram it down their throats. And that appears to be exactly what's happening. I also am seeing a lot of media malpractice in this story. There is absolutely
from the beginning.
There's really no coverage about the demands. I've even spoken privately with some people, and they're like, well, why are these guys going on strike in the first place? And I'll explain. I'll be like, they don't have any paid sick time. They work like 30 days on. When if they get even a cold, like they can't take any time off and they don't get paid. And they're like, oh, that sounds kind of crazy. I was like, yeah, you think?
Right, right. And this is their basically only shot to improve that deal. I mean, I can tell you what's going to happen. Like, this deal, if what we expect to happen ultimately happens and the tentative agreement is crammed down their throat, there is some talk online of a wildcat strike, of going ahead with the strike, even though, it would be technically illegal. More likely what's going to happen is you just have a mass exodus of workers. And the railroads, and this is where, this is about so much more than just what these individual workers deserve, even though that is such an important part of it that we never want to lose sight of. Because it also is kind of a seminal moment in labor history. You have this burgeoning grassroots labor movement. These things are very dependent on momentum. They're very dependent on the mood and the tone that is struck from the very top. We saw what happened with Ronald Reagan back in the day when he broke that air traffic controller strike. That really put a chill through the labor movement for decades. And especially because transit workers are so visible and so central to the economy, these things can really, really set the tone. So you got this dude who claims to be, oh, I'm going to be the most pro-union president in history. And listen, I have given him a lot of credit for some of the personnel he's put in place in particular that has, in fact, enabled this grassroots labor movement. Now, on the other hand, he, the PRO Act, he floated it, he dropped it almost immediately, didn't really fight for it. He had workers to the White House as this sort of like virtue signal deal with Christian Smalls of Amazon Labor Union, but he never actually used the power of his office to do what he said he would do, which is to deny federal contracts to any union busters. So he's fallen short every step of the way, let's be really clear. But this is an extraordinary betrayal. And it's not just railroad workers who are taking notice. And that's why this is so extraordinarily significant. On that betrayal, just to underscore it here, Jonah Furman, who of course has been a phenomenal labor reporter and has been tracking this from the very beginning. If you don't follow, make sure that you do. He says, after the House votes to include 7 paid sick days for rail workers, the White House comes out with a statement that doesn't even mention those paid sick days. So they were given another chance to support paid sick days for rail workers, and Biden clearly chooses not to. Let me read a little bit of Biden's statement because this was kind of revealing. He said, in part, in this latest statement, without the certainty of a final vote to avoid a shutdown this week, railroads will begin to halt the movement of critical materials like chemicals to clean our drinking water as soon as this weekend. Let me say that again, without action this week, disruptions to our auto supply chains, our ability to move food to tables, and our ability to remove hazardous waste from gasoline refineries will begin. So there's 2 things to note there. Number 1, he's not talking about the needs of the workers. He's talking about the potential economic threat. So he's focused on like, oh, you can't have this disruption of a potential strike. So that is a very corporate-friendly narrative that he's putting up there. Number 2, as Jonah says, doesn't even mention the paid sick leave that just passed through the House. He could be urging the Senate to pass that as well. And I said there were 2 things. There's actually a third thing, which is that he says without the certainty of the final vote, railroads will begin to halt the movement of critical materials. So that's actually the way he says that. It's not actually a strike action he's worried about. He's worried about a lockout, which is what we saw last time around when before the deadline actually came up, the railroad bosses decided to scale back their activity as a sort of an economic threat to heighten their own leverage. So a lot that's very revealing there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think this is about political motivation more than anything, which is he doesn't believe that there is any real benefit to standing with the workforce, more so than, here, look, let's also be honest. Like, if this happens, gas price will probably go up by $2 or $3 a gallon. Out west, an extraordinary amount of their gas comes via railway. On top of goods, there's a lot of other perishable goods and other things that also move by rail. And so they're like, well, the economic disruption that would cause political problems for us is just simply not worth it. But look, you have the authority to force a deal. Like, you can force actually whatever deal you want.
Yeah.
You could endorse that. And they're just choosing not to do it, Krystal. I think that is, again, if the media had done a better job of explaining this to people, I don't think that they would really comprehend how little the demand on the railway workers actually are, and the extent to which the rail companies are willing to effectively crash the economy if they want to, just to keep on their grubby profits and continue stock buybacks. There's not even any provision in the deal, which Congress would happily do, be like, okay, well, we'll accept this deal, but then you can't buy it back.
No more stock buybacks.
They don't even put that in there. We even put that in the COVID bailout. Like, not even in this one.
Stock buybacks used to be illegal, and they should be illegal again, because it really is just like financial fakery and rigging and more profits to the people who don't need it, to the very, very rich and executive class. And this also, if this deal without the paid sick leave goes through, this is very likely to have deleterious impacts on the rail freight industry, because already through the poor business decision-making of the rail bosses, already they are stretched extraordinarily thin. And this was a trend that started before the COVID pandemic. Then the pandemic exacerbates everything. They've laid off so much of their workforce. And then when they say, hey guys, come back, well, guess what? People have moved on and they aren't too excited to go back to an industry where they get 0 paid sick leave. So you're likely to see a continued exodus. They're very likely to continue to struggle to fill those holes. And so ultimately, what have we experienced in terms of the inflation and the supply chain disruptions? Like, when we down the road a year from now are saying, geez, why isn't this working well? Remember this moment right here where these bosses were so greedy that they wouldn't even agree to give their workers a few days of paid sick leave. And, the workers, many of whom voted for Joe Biden, some of whom didn't, but many of whom did, feel extraordinarily betrayed. Credit to the New York Times for actually talking to a few workers about this. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. They highlight one legislative representative for his local union, a guy named Gabe Christensen, a longtime freight railroad conductor. He worked hard to help elect Joe Biden as president in 2020. He says, yeah, I have shirts from me campaigning, blue-collar Biden shirts. I knocked on doors for him for weeks and weeks and weeks. But since Monday, when President Biden urged Congress to impose a labor agreement that his union had voted down, Mr. Christensen has been besieged by text from furious coworkers whom he had encouraged to support the president. I am trying to calm them down, he said. It's just heartbreaking to think of what sense of betrayal these workers are facing right now. And they also quote someone else who works for the railroads who says exactly what we were talking about. You're likely to see an exodus. He says it's going to be like having a strike without having a strike because you're going to have so many workers ultimately leave this industry. And, rail freight is incredibly critical to everything we do in this country. So if you have a massive labor shortage there, it's going to be a big problem. And Saagar, I think in a lot of ways with Biden, the original sin was the presidential board that he put together. That was like the first step in this process. So he gets together this group, they negotiate amongst themselves, they come out with this potential deal that sided with the bosses like 100%, did not even expand a single day of paid sick leave. And so that was the starting point. I mean, these workers have been saying the whole time, this really isn't about wages. Of course, more wages are nice, but this is about standard quality of living. This is about standard of living concerns and specifically around paid sick leave. And so his original board doesn't even deal with that issue at all. And I really think from there, that's where things start going sideways in terms of these workers' demands.
No, I think you're right. And I think what's very important, again, to understand on this is that these guys did not negotiate in good faith. I just don't think any of us could expect that this outcome would have happened if the Railway Labor Act didn't exist. And that's the point, which is, actually, I'll get to this when I'm talking about the Republicans, but I think there's an important, almost quasi-libertarian aspect to this. We're like, hold on a second. You have a democratic, non-governmental institution, the union, of the actual workers themselves who are like, this is not going to work for us. And then the government just gets to come in and say, no, actually, that's not it. Since when do they get to set the basic conditions of your employment? In a free market capitalist system, at least the way we have it, we're supposed to set the floor and then everybody can go do whatever they want from there. This takes freedom really out of the equation in terms of the ability for you and collectively to determine the conditions of your own working. I think it's actually really crazy.
Yeah, and they kind of want to have it both ways with the Railway Labor Act, and that's the law that governs how all of this has ultimately unfolded, and that gives Congress the authority to cram down whatever deal on workers that they ultimately want, because that recognizes, rail is really critical to our economy. So that's why they put this in place ultimately to, avoid the economic fallout. But if you're recognizing it's so critical to the economy, you can't also then just leave it up to the whims of whatever is going to make the most money for this handful of railroad bosses. So I think that is a really important piece of this. Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now. And Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us. And if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.